I still remember that morning so clearly. The cold sea wind from Charleston cut through the air, and my daughter-in-law, Megan, screamed right in my face, "Get out, you old freeloader! There's no place for you in this house anymore." I stood there, on the porch, the very porch I had built with my own hands, brick by brick, using money earned from that old sewing machine. They took over my home, threw my things out, and even faked papers claiming I was mentally unstable. But what they didn't know was that the woman they looked down on had once beaten poverty, widowhood, and the cruelty of life itself. Today's story is my journey to reclaim not just my home, but my dignity and justice as a mother. Listen till the end, because you'll want to know how a 70-year-old woman made the very family that betrayed her bow down before the law. That morning, I drove my old silver car back to the seaside house in Charleston, the place I once called my little paradise. I planned to stay for a few days, tidy up the geranium garden, and watch the sunset, like I always used to. But as soon as I turned down the narrow road leading home, my heart sank. 3 unfamiliar cars were parked across the driveway. Loud music blasted from the backyard, and the air reeked of smoke and beer. I stopped the car, stepped out, and froze. Children I had never seen before were running wild across the lawn, kicking a ball straight into the red geranium pots I had cared for over 15 years. Empty beer cans rolled across the brick path I used to polish by hand. The windows were wide open. My silk curtains fluttered in the wind, the very ones I had sewn myself, now stained with grease and dust. The house that was once peaceful and spotless looked like a battlefield after a wild party. Clutching my keychain, I stood there, confused. Maybe Robert, my son, had invited friends over for the weekend? But when the door opened, it wasn't Robert standing there. It was Megan, my daughter-in-law. She wore a cream apron embroidered with the words, "Home Sweet Home," the same one I had made for her in her first year of marriage. Her eyes were cold as steel. She crossed her arms, blocking the doorway. "What are you doing here, Eleanor?" I blinked in disbelief. "This is my house. I came to clean up like always. Didn't Robert tell you?" She smirked. "Robert said we could use the house whenever we wanted. It's ridiculous to let it sit empty when my family and the kids need a place to relax. Surely you understand that, don't you?" I glanced around. Strangers everywhere. Food smoking on the grill. The living room a mess. Laughter echoing through the walls I had built with my own hands. "Megan," I said carefully, "this property is mine. I pay the bills, the taxes, everything. The deed is under my name." She cut me off, voice sharp as glass. "Oh, here we go again. Your house, your money. Robert is your son, isn't he? So what's his is mine. That's how family works, right?" Behind her, a woman with bleach blonde hair, probably Megan's mother, strolled out holding a cocktail, her lips curling in mockery. "Oh, so this is the famous mother-in-law you mentioned." I expected someone classier. The young people around them snickered. I stood frozen. In 70 years of life, I had known what it felt like to be looked down on, but never by my own family. Taking a deep breath, I forced calm into my voice. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to collect a few personal items, then I'll leave." Megan raised a brow. "A few things? We already cleaned out your room. Your stuff's in the trash bags by the garage. Don't make a scene. This house is our vacation home now." The words hit me like a slap. My chest tightened. Everyone was watching. Curious, amused, even pitying. One of the younger girls, probably Megan's niece, scoffed. "If you're uncomfortable, why don't you just rent a hotel? Seems easier." The air grew heavy. I pressed my lips together, steadying my voice. "Fine, I'll go. But remember this, Megan Dyson. Every brick in this house was bought with my own money. Every tree, every stone was placed by me. And when I come back, I expect you all to be gone." She burst into laughter. "You sound like a lawyer. What are you going to do, sue your own son?" My reply was quiet but firm. "If that's what it takes." Yes. Silence fell. Then, as I turned away, the music and laughter behind me resumed, louder than ever, as if I were invisible. Walking down the path toward the sea, I looked back one last time. The house that once sheltered my family now swarmed with strangers. I remembered little Robert, years ago, running through that same garden shouting, "Mom, can I help you water the flowers?" And now, that same son stood silent, while his wife threw me out of the home that love built. I reached for my phone, thinking of calling him. But when I saw his name, my hands trembled too much to press the button. If he truly allowed this, then this wasn't just a fight between a mother and a daughter-in-law. It was war within a family. Sitting in my car, I looked back at the house one more time. A strong gust swept through, scattering the petals of the red geraniums down the path. They fluttered like fragile memories, beautiful, but painfully sharp. I whispered to myself, if they think I'm just a weak old woman, they'll soon regret it. The engine started. My car rolled slowly toward downtown Charleston. Inside me, the shame was gone, replaced by something colder, clearer, unshakable. I had lost my husband. I had lost my youth. But I had never lost my pride. And this time, I wouldn't lose my home. Not without a fight. If you feel for this woman's story, hit like and comment 1 to show you believe that no one has the right to trample on a mother's hard work and dignity, even if it means fighting to the very end. I drove in silence. The sound of the Charleston waves echoed in my mind, reminding me of a time when I believed that love and sacrifice alone could hold everything together. But life isn't that kind. As the small buildings blurred past my window, I remembered the first day I came to this city, carrying just one suitcase, a small savings book, and the broken heart of a widow. 20 years ago, I was 50. Robert had just graduated college, but hadn't found steady work yet. I was a seamstress in Charleston, taking wedding dress alterations, sewing school uniforms, and making curtains for the wealthy homes around town. My hands were always swollen from the needlework, sometimes bleeding, but I never thought of it as suffering. Every dollar I saved became a brick in my dream, a small seaside home where I could one day rest in peace. I still remember the day I bought that patch of land, just sand and weeds back then. The young architect looked doubtful when I said I wanted to build a vacation house. "Mrs. Crawford," he said gently, "this project will cost at least $45,000. Are you sure you can afford it?" I opened my savings book and flipped through the pages filled with years of tiny, handwritten numbers. "I don't owe anyone," I told him. "I've just sewn enough wedding dresses to fund my dream." He smiled then and began sketching the first design. For months I worked like someone possessed, sewing by day, checking construction at night. I couldn't carry bricks, but I painted walls, planted trees, and wiped windows myself. Robert was 25 then, coming to help me every weekend. He'd look at me, half proud, half worried. "Mom, why don't you rest? You've been working non-stop." I smiled, wiping the sweat from my brow. "You know, son, I'm not afraid of getting tired. I'm afraid of stopping and having nothing left to dream about." He hugged me tightly, laughing. "When I have my own family someday, I'll bring them here every holiday. This house will always be yours." When the house was finished, I felt truly alive. Cream walls, red roof, and rows of blooming geraniums along the porch. I bought a used wicker table set from the thrift market, and Robert and I shared our first dinner there. I remember him saying, "Mom, you're the strongest person I know. No one can ever take away what you've built." But 20 years later, that same son stood silent while his wife threw me out. Betrayal feels strange. It doesn't roar or explode. It chills you, slowly, sinking into your bones like ocean wind. I tried to find excuses for Robert. Maybe Megan pressured him. Maybe he thought I'd understand. But silence. Silence is the cruelest answer of all. That afternoon, I stopped by the old sewing shop where I used to work. The new owner didn't know me, but I saw my old Singer machine still sitting in the corner. I had stitched hundreds of wedding gowns there, One of them for Megan, 10 years ago. I could still see her radiant smile as she tried it on, saying sweetly, "Mother Crawford, I hope I can be just like you, strong and graceful." Who could have imagined that a decade later, that same mouth would spit the harshest words at me? I left the shop and drove to the beach. The sky was gray, the waves steady. Sitting on a weathered bench, I opened my old savings book. A few untouched pages remained. My handwriting trembled, but was still clear. Every dollar for the future, for the seaside home. A bitter laugh escaped me. That future now belonged to strangers, while I sat here like someone lost inside her own memories. I wondered, was it my fault for being too kind? For letting my son believe that everything I owned would one day be his? Or was it my mistake to think that love could replace legal boundaries? They say a woman who loves enough will be loved in return. But I learned something else. If you don't protect your own limits, love becomes a trap. That night, I checked into the Golden Sands Hotel, a small room with a window facing the ocean. I couldn't sleep. The crashing waves outside seemed to call me back to that house. The life I had built, now turned into someone else's playground. I sat up, opened my phone, and scrolled through old photos. Robert and me, standing beside the construction site, his face beaming with pride. I zoomed in, touched his smiling face, and whispered softly into the dark, "Son, have you forgotten?" I didn't build that house for someone to take it away. I built it to remind myself that even when I'm alone or betrayed, I can still stand strong. I put the phone down, and for the first time in years, I felt that old fire return. The same fire that once built my world from nothing. Part of me wanted to let it go, to believe things would settle. But another part, stronger, clearer, whispered back, "No one has the right to take what I paid for with my youth." Outside, the moonlight covered the sea in a thin silver glow. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and knew I wouldn't stay quiet. Tomorrow, I'd go back, not to beg, but to face the truth head-on and see just how far they'd go to destroy what I built. If you were me, what would you do? Would you stay silent and endure it? Or stand up to defend what you rightfully earned? Share your thoughts below. Do you agree or disagree with my choice? I truly want to know. Would you choose family? Or would you choose justice? The next morning, I went back to the seaside house. The Charleston sky was heavy and gray, the clouds low like a storm about to come. I parked at the gate and took a deep breath. Even though I had prepared myself, seeing those 3 strange cars still blocking the driveway made my chest tighten with pain. The white wooden gate I used to clean every weekend was scratched and peeling. The path was full of wrappers, cans, sand, and grease. I walked up to the door and rang the bell, but nobody came. I had to knock 3 times before the door opened. Standing there was a blonde woman with bright lipstick and a flashy silk robe, Megan's mother. She looked me over with a mocking smile. "Oh, it's you again. What do you want now? I thought we made things clear yesterday." I kept my voice calm. "I came to take a few personal things. I need to see Megan." "Megan is busy. She's making breakfast. You should mind your manners and not bother my daughter." I brushed past her without another word. Inside, it hit me like a blow. The smell of cigarettes, burnt food, and old alcohol made the house hard to breathe in. The curtain I had sewn by hand was torn at one corner, the sofa stained with grease, dishes piled on the table. "My God," I whispered, "this is not my home anymore." I walked through the living room into the kitchen. Megan was there, cooking and talking on the phone. She turned when she saw me, her face full of irritation. "You're still here?" I thought I made myself clear. I just want a few personal things. I packed your things, she said, pointing. They're in black trash bags in the garage. Take them fast. I need the space for the car. I opened the garage door. Black bags were stacked up. I knelt and opened one. My clothes were crushed. The sweater I had knitted was stained with oil and ripped. A photo of Robert and me at his graduation was warped and water-stained. My hands shook as I picked them up, and tears came. Megan's mother called out from behind. Need help? Where are you planning to take those old things? Strange. I thought old people knew how to let go. I turned to her and my voice no longer trembled. You're right. Old people should let go. But of people who don't respect other people's hard work. Silence fell. She shrugged and walked away, but I saw a flash of awkwardness on her well-made-up face. When I went back to my bedroom, my heart tightened. That room had been my careful work for years. White sheets, a window that let in sea breezes, a wooden wardrobe that smelled like pine. Now clothes were scattered, and 2 children slept on the bed. I realized they were Megan's sister's kids, children I had never met. They need a place to sleep, Megan's mother said in a sour tone. You don't need this room anymore. This is my room, I said quietly. Yours, she laughed. Don't you get it? Your son gave permission. My husband says the law is clear. When the son is the sole heir, the parent's property will eventually be his. You're just holding on to it for now. I didn't want to argue, but then my eyes landed on the secret cupboard behind the wooden panel, where I kept important papers and some jewelry. It had been thrown open. Files were scattered on the floor. I crouched and began picking up papers and found a stack of fresh documents. The top read, Application to transfer property ownership. Recipient, Robert Crawford. I froze. The next pages looked wrong. My signature was copied, messy but trying to look like mine. There was even a medical note claiming age-related memory decline, signed by a doctor I had never seen. Megan laughed behind me. What are you looking through? I stood up, holding the papers. What is this? She glanced and acted casual. Oh, just documents to make things tidy later. Robert said it would make it legal. Don't worry. I looked straight at her. Legal means genuine consent, Megan. This is forgery. Her face tightened. Then she sneered. Careful with your words. Your son won't be pleased if his mother calls his wife a thief. I don't need to call anyone. I just need proof. She laughed. What are you going to do? Sue me? Call the police? That would be funny. Who would believe a 70-year-old woman saying her son and daughter-in-law plotted to steal her house? I tightened my grip on the papers. If I must, I will make them believe. I left the house quickly, my heart pounding but my mind sharp. Now wasn't the time to act recklessly. I needed evidence, truth, and time. They thought I was weak. They were wrong. As I got into my car, Megan shouted after me, You should behave, Eleanor. At your age, you should enjoy the rest of your life instead of clinging to old things. That house will be ours sooner or later. I looked at her through the rearview mirror and said softly, No one owns what they haven't earned, Megan. No one. On the drive back, I kept the stack of papers in my bag. Each fake signature felt like another cut into my trust in my son. But a different fire was growing inside me. The fire of a woman who started from nothing, survived loss, and built a life by her own hands. They thought I would be silent. They forgot I never stay quiet in the face of injustice. That night I sat by the hotel window, watching the dark sea. Lights shimmered on waves like broken memories. I took the papers out and organized them, then clipped them together. I would keep them as proof of betrayal and the beginning of my fight. If you've ever been treated like I was, dismissed, robbed, labeled weak, remember, silence is not your only choice. Share your feelings in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to follow my journey, the journey where justice isn't given, but must be taken back. I stared at the stack of papers in my hands under the soft yellow light of the hotel room. Each shaky letter seemed to whisper a story of betrayal I still couldn't fully believe. I sat there all night, reading line after line. Transfer of ownership, beneficiary confirmation, unstable mental condition. Every word, every punctuation mark felt like a blade carving deep into the trust I once had for my own son. At sunrise, I took the papers to the notary office I'd worked with years ago. The older clerk squinted at me when I asked, "Can you verify this signature? They claim it's mine." She frowned, studied it for a moment, then shook her head. "No, Mrs. Eleanor, that's not your signature. I notarized your house documents before. I remember your handwriting well. Someone tried to copy it." My fist tightened. Inside me was both grief and a cold, sharp clarity. "Can you print me an official statement of that?" "Of course," she said, "but you should know. If this is forged property documentation, you can press criminal charges." "I know," I said quietly. Stepping out onto the Charleston street, I suddenly felt like a stranger in my own city. The old church, the maple trees, the chime of wind bells outside the coffee shop, they all seemed to be watching a part of my life crumble. I called Robert, keeping my voice steady. "Son, I need to see you. Just you. Harborview Cafe, 10 o'clock. There was silence on the line. Then his uneasy voice. "Mom, what's going on?" "Megan said you're getting emotional." "Good," I said evenly. "Then come see what emotional looks like." At 10 sharp, Robert walked in. Neat shirt, hair combed, the same careful appearance. But he couldn't meet my eyes. I placed the papers on the table and slid them toward him. "Do you know what this is?" He glanced at them and sighed. "Mom, Megan just wanted to make things simpler. You're getting older. Transferring the title early would make things easier later."
"And this fake Alzheimer's diagnosis, that's making things easier too?" His face paled. "Megan only. I'm not talking about Megan. I'm talking to you, Robert Crawford. Did you sign this document?" He went silent. The clinking of spoons and cups filled the cafe, but between us was a silence thick enough to choke on. Finally, Robert nodded. "Yes, but I didn't file it yet. You have to understand, I'm in debt. My job's unstable. Megan just wanted to protect our future." I let out a bitter laugh. What kind of future is built on greed and betrayal? "Mom, don't say that. Are you afraid of the truth? Or just afraid people will find out you tried to steal your own mother's house?" He lowered his voice, nervous. "Mom, you don't understand. If you don't transfer the house, the lenders, so you're that desperate. You'd pretend your mother has dementia just to save yourself? Tell me, Robert, do you even feel shame anymore?" For the first time, I saw not my son, but a coward hiding behind his pressed shirt and fake composure. "I used to think," I said slowly, "that losing my husband was the worst pain I'd ever feel. But I was wrong. The real pain is losing the child I once trusted completely." Robert stared at the floor, silent. I stood up, my voice steady but cold. "You say I don't understand? I understand perfectly. And from this moment on, I'll do something you never thought I could. Protect what's mine. Through the law." I walked out, leaving him sitting there under the midday light. As the door closed behind me, I heard him whisper, "Mom." But I didn't turn back. That afternoon, I went to the Mount Pleasant police station to file a report. The young officer asked many questions, his tone doubtful at first. But when he saw the notarized proof of forgery, his expression hardened. "Would you like to submit a written statement, ma'am?" "I will, and I want a lawyer present." That night, I got a call from an old acquaintance, Mr. Peterson, the bank manager who once handled my savings account. "I heard what happened," he said. "If you need help, I know a trustworthy attorney." "Thank you," I replied, "but I don't need anyone's pity." "I'm not pitying you, Eleanor," he he said softly. I respect you. You're the only woman I've ever known who built a home with nothing but a sewing needle and her own 2 hands. That made me go quiet for a long time, not from pride, but from the realization that sometimes strangers value you more than your own blood. The next morning, I met attorney Thomas Gallagher, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s with a calm voice. After reviewing the documents, he said, "They committed forgery.
That's a criminal offense. But I need to ask you one thing. Are you ready to go all the way, even if it costs you your son?" I didn't hesitate. If my son has already lost his morals, then I have nothing left to lose. Thomas nodded slowly and placed a new file on the table. Then we begin. I'll handle the law. You need to be ready for the storm. Because when justice takes your side, the truth will surface. And it never does so gently. When I left his office, the wind had picked up, swirling sand through the air like a warning of the battle to come. That night, I stood at the hotel window, looking out at the lights reflecting over the restless sea. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had only one thought left. They chose to fight with lies. I'll fight back with the truth. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that. But there was no turning back. Every year I spent working, every ounce of faith I'd placed in my family, I owed it to myself to reclaim their meaning. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've seen your loved ones turn against you for money or pride, I want to hear your story. Share your feelings in the comments and subscribe to follow my journey, where every truth will rise and justice will never sleep again. The next morning, I sat in attorney Thomas Gallagher's office, a thick pile of documents spread out before me. Printouts from the bank and the notary's office. Thomas flipped through each page, his sharp eyes cutting like glass. "You were right," he said in a low voice. "The signature's forged. The seal isn't authentic either. Whoever did this had help from someone inside the office. And your son, he knew more than he's admitting." I sat still, fingers intertwined. Since my husband's death, I'd grown used to loneliness. But this was a different kind of lonely. It had the face of my own son, the one I'd once trusted more than anyone in the world. Thomas glanced up, his tone softer. "Do you want me to handle this fast or thoroughly?" "I want justice," I said. "Not fast, just right." That afternoon, Thomas called. "Robert wants to meet you. I think you should go, but not alone." "I'll sit at the next table just observing," I agreed. I needed to hear the truth, straight from my son's mouth. The cafe wasn't the fancy place from before, but a small, quiet one by the ferry dock. Robert arrived early, sitting with his head down, turning a cold cup of coffee between his palms. He looked older, or maybe it was guilt that had aged him. "Mom," he said hoarsely, "I don't even know where to start." "Start with the truth," I replied. He swallowed hard. "I did sign the papers, but I swear I didn't submit them. Megan said it was just paperwork, something to make it easier to get a bank loan. I didn't think it would go this far." I stared into his eyes. "Did you know they faked my medical report?" He didn't answer. His silence said everything. I took a deep breath to steady my voice. "Robert, I can forgive mistakes if you face them. But you let someone use my name, forge my signature, and try to steal what I built with my own hands. I don't know whether you're more afraid of losing your house or your pride, but you've already lost something far greater. My trust." He gripped his hands tightly, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I'm just trapped. I owe a lot, Mom. If I didn't agree, Megan said she'd leave and take the kids." I said coldly, "So you chose to let me be the one cast out instead." His lips trembled. I could see the boy I once knew, buried under fear and weakness. My anger rose, but so did a deep sorrow. The son who once helped me plant red geraniums had turned into a man too scared to do what was right. "Since your father died," I said slowly, "I've never asked for anything except respect. I didn't want your money or your help. I just wanted to know that our home, the one your father and I dreamed of, still meant something, that it wasn't a price tag on your debt." "Megan doesn't see it that way," he murmured. "She says you're holding on too long, that you've lived enough and it's time to pass things down." I smiled faintly. She's half right. I have lived long enough to prove that kindness isn't weakness. And today, you'll all see what it means when an old woman refuses to be forgotten. At that moment, Thomas quietly approached from the next table. He placed a folder on the table between us. "Robert," he said firmly, "we're filing charges for forgery. But since your mother wants to give you one last chance, I suggest you withdraw every document you've signed and issue a written confession before we go to court." Robert's voice cracked. "If I do that, Megan will never forgive me." Thomas replied, calm and cold, "If you don't, the law won't forgive you either." Silence filled the air. Robert finally looked up at me, eyes torn with conflict. "Mom, can't you stop this?" "I'll bring you home. I'll make Megan apologize." I shook my head. "No, Robert. I'm not going back as a guest in my own house. I'm going back as its rightful owner, with my dignity intact." I picked up my bag and stood. "If there's still a trace of conscience left in you, remember this. I don't want you to lose in court. I want you to win back the man you used to be." Robert said nothing. As I left, he sat there with his head in his hands. Thomas walked beside me and murmured, "You did the right thing." Sometimes, justice isn't just about punishment. It's the lesson people have to learn the hard way. I nodded, staring ahead. "I don't want to hate my son, Mr. Gallagher. I just want him to understand. Love built on lies isn't love at all." That afternoon, Thomas sent me the draft lawsuit and a list of next steps. When I signed it, my hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing that this was war. That night, my phone rang. No caller ID. Megan's voice came through, dripping with mockery. "So, you really think you can beat me? Go ahead and try. I've planned for everything. Remember, Robert's still your son. If I fall, he falls with me." I answered, steady and cold. "If dragging others down is the only way you can stay standing, then go ahead. But don't forget, I've survived worse than you could ever imagine. You, Megan, won't last a day in my storm." I hung up and stared out the window. The moon hung low, its pale light glinting off the ocean. My reflection in the glass wore a calm, almost cold smile, one I barely recognized. I knew then, tomorrow, the real storm would begin. If you've ever faced a choice between family and justice, tell me, what would you choose? Would you forgive? Or would you stand and fight for what's right? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might just give strength to someone out there who's been hurt the same way. I stayed by the window until morning. The first light of Charleston slipped through the hotel curtains, shining across the scattered piles of documents on the table. Each sheet felt like a piece of memory, a fracture in the bond between mother and son. A wound I never thought I'd have to face. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew exactly what to do now. No tears, no pleading, just action. That morning, Thomas Gallagher called. "Are you ready?" "I've been ready," I said, "since the day they called me a freeloader." He chuckled softly. "Good. I like working with people who know what they're fighting for." We went to the Mount Pleasant courthouse to file the lawsuit. Outside, the wind whipped hard, tugging at the papers in Thomas's hands, but he held them firm. You don't need to say much, he told me. Let me handle the legal part. All you need to do is keep that look, the face of someone who doesn't bow. I nodded. Inside me, there was no trembling left, only calm. Once you've lost everything, fear has nothing left to hold on to. That afternoon, we stopped by the bank where Robert and Megan had tried to mortgage my house. Mr. Peterson, the bank director, greeted me with a look that mixed sympathy and respect. "Eleanor, I didn't think you'd come back like this," he said, pouring me a glass of water. "Neither did I," replied. "But justice doesn't come to those who wait, only to those who move." He handed me a folder. "This is a copy of the loan application Megan submitted." She listed the house under Robert's name only, attaching a fake medical report saying you were unfit to manage your affairs. I held off approving it. Something didn't feel right. Now I know why Thomas skimmed the file, nodding. It's enough for prosecution. I looked at Mr. Peterson and smiled faintly. "You haven't changed. Still won't sign anything unless you're sure." That saved me. He smiled back, a little sadly. "Not everyone is lucky enough to have someone who still believes in them, Eleanor." By evening, as I left the bank, my phone rang. It was Robert. I hesitated, then answered. "Mom, what are you doing?" "I heard you filed the lawsuit." "Yes, and I don't plan to withdraw it." "Are you trying to destroy this family?" I took a slow breath. "No, Robert. I'm not destroying anything. You and your wife already did that. I'm just cleaning up the mess." Silence. I could hear his uneven breathing through the phone. Then quietly he said, "If you win, I lose everything. My job, my house, my reputation." "Winning or losing doesn't matter," I told him. "What matters is what you learn from it." Sometimes, a person has to hit the bottom before they remember how to stand. When I hung up, Thomas asked, "Do you regret any of this?" "I regret trusting too easily," I said, "but not fighting for what's right." That night I sat down and wrote everything in a notebook, every detail, the dates, the words, the evidence, even the pain. I wanted anyone who read it one day to know that a woman named Eleanor Crawford refused to let anyone take away her dignity. 3 days later, the police officially opened the investigation. Megan was summoned, along with the doctor who'd signed the fake report. The news spread quickly around the neighborhood. A few neighbors called, hesitant but supportive. "We heard about it. It's hard to believe, but you did the right thing. The elderly deserve respect too." Meanwhile, Thomas kept gathering evidence. "Megan has no idea we have confirmations from both the notary and the bank," he told me. "They assumed you'd stay quiet, too afraid of gossip. Now we'll let them dig their own graves." The next day, we went to finalize the filing at court. When I lifted the pen to sign the final document, I paused. Thomas asked, "Something wrong?" I smiled softly. "No, I was just remembering the first time I signed the papers to buy my land. My hands shook the same way, but that time it was from happiness. Today, they shake because I'm freeing myself." Thomas laid his hand gently on the file. Justice often begins with a signature just like this. That evening, I drove past the seaside house. The windows were shut, the curtains drawn. Everything looked still. Through the glass, I saw Megan, pale, restless. A part of me, though I hated it, felt a flicker of pity. I knew the fear of losing everything. But then I remembered the morning she screamed at me to get out, that cruel smirk, and the pity vanished. The following day, the police came to place a temporary seal on the property pending judgment. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering. Some recognized me and nodded. I just stood there, quietly, watching from afar. Thomas came to stand beside me. "Do you want to go inside?" he asked. "No," I said softly. "I just want to look at it one last time." in silence. The next time I walk through that door, I want it to be the day justice is served. He looked at me and said slowly, "You know, in my career, I've met many people who sought justice, but very few who managed to keep their compassion. Most only wanted revenge." I smiled faintly. Revenge fades. Truth doesn't. It's the only thing that lets us sleep at night. That night I returned to my hotel and wrote one last line in my notebook for the day. I'm not fighting to win. I'm fighting not to be disrespected. Then I turned off the light and opened the window, letting the sea breeze fill the room. Outside, Charleston shimmered under the pale moonlight. I knew tomorrow would be the hardest day, the day I'd face those who betrayed me. But I also knew I wouldn't be alone anymore. The law was on my side, and so was my conscience. If someone has ever broken your trust, remember, no one can define your worth but you. Leave a comment below, even just a simple "I understand you," to let me know that somewhere out there, someone else believes this too. Justice isn't just a right. It's how we protect our soul. I understand her. Those 3 words kept echoing in my mind the next morning when Thomas called. "Today's the day," he said. "We're enforcing the temporary eviction order. The police will be there, and the notary as well. You just need to stay calm and stand where you always have, on the side of justice." I stood by the hotel window, watching the sea. The sky over Charleston was impossibly clear, sunlight glimmering over the water. Part of me still trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what was coming. I didn't know how I'd feel standing in front of that house again, the place where I once laughed, cried, and believed I was loved. But I clenched my hands and took a deep breath. It was time. When we arrived, the street leading to the house was already packed. Neighbors whispered on both sides, a few holding up phones to record. 2 police cars flashed red and blue at the gate, and Thomas's black SUV stopped beside them. He stepped out in his sharp gray suit, files in hand, and gave me a nod. "Hold steady, Mrs. Crawford." Today, everything becomes clear. Megan appeared in the doorway, pale, disheveled, but still trying to look composed. "What's going on here? You can't do this!" she shouted when she saw the officers. Thomas raised the documents. "This is a temporary eviction order issued by the Mount Pleasant District Court, based on charges of property forgery and falsified medical records. By law, you and your family must vacate the premises until trial." Megan let out a bitter laugh, her voice shaking. "You think I'm stupid? I'm Robert's wife, the rightful co-owner of this house." Thomas's reply was crisp. "No. The rightful owner is Mrs. Eleanor Crawford. The notarized deed and 3 years of property tax records all bear her name. Here's the certified copy." He held up the papers and read the title aloud. I didn't say a word. I just looked at Megan, the woman who once called me a burden. Her face drained of color as she glanced around for Robert, but he wasn't there. Then another familiar, venomous voice cut through the silence. My God, the police too? This old woman really doesn't know her place. It was Megan's mother. She strode forward, arms crossed, blocking the officers. "You can't just throw a whole family out!" The police chief, a tall, steady man, spoke calmly. "Ma'am, this is a court order. If you interfere, we'll be forced to proceed by enforcement." The air tightened like a drawn string. I could hear my heartbeat clearly, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I stepped forward, my voice low but steady, rough from emotion, yet firm. "This house is still mine. I bought it. I paid the taxes. I kept it standing for 20 years. No one has the right to take away what I built with my own hands." I reached into my bag and pulled out the deed. "This is my signature. Real, not forged. No loans, no lies. and no one can take it away." The crowd went silent. Only the distant crash of waves and the faint hum of a phone camera broke the stillness. Megan's face flushed red as she lunged for the paper. "You're crazy!" "Mom, do something." But the officer stepped between us. "Mrs. Dyson, please remain calm. You have 2 hours to pack your belongings and leave. Any resistance will be added to the report." I watched her tremble, fists clenched tight. I didn't feel triumphant or merciful. What I felt was quiet, the quiet of justice when it finally speaks, not with anger, but with action. Thomas came over and murmured, "You don't need to stay. I can oversee the procedure." I shook my head. "No, I want to stay until they're gone. They threw me out once. Now I'll watch them leave the same way." 2 hours passed. Megan packed in silence, while her mother muttered curses the officers ignored. When the last car rolled down the driveway, I stepped onto the porch. The wood was still scratched. The air still smelled of smoke. But my hand on the doorframe felt like it was touching my own heartbeat again. Thomas stood beside me. "It's yours again," he said quietly. I nodded. I never really lost it. They only borrowed it without permission. A small group of local reporters arrived, microphones ready. One asked for a statement. I said just one line: "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did." When they treat you like you don't matter, don't stay silent. The law is the voice of those too tired to scream. When they left, I walked through the hallway. The walls still bore handprints, but a few of my red geraniums outside had survived. I knelt, touched one fragile bloom and smiled softly. "Thank you for staying," I whispered. That night, I didn't go back to the hotel. I sat in the empty living room, the sea wind whispering through the window. For the first time in months, I felt light. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't given up. The next morning, I found a letter under the door. No name, but I recognized the handwriting. It was from Robert. "Mom, I can't face you. I know I was wrong. I didn't have the courage to stand between you and Megan, but I'll accept the consequences. I just hope you're okay. Please don't hate me." I folded the letter. I didn't cry. Maybe it was the first time my son had been truly honest with me. And I knew then, truth, even late, was worth more than 1,000 empty apologies. That afternoon, Thomas and I returned to court to finalize the property documents. He smiled as I signed the last paper. "Mrs. Crawford, I've never seen anyone go through a battle like this and stay so calm." "You can rest now," I smiled back. "Not yet, Mr. Gallagher. There's still one thing I have to do, but not in court." He frowned slightly. "What is it?" I looked out toward the sea, glowing in the golden sunset. "I'm going to see my son, one last time. Not to accuse him, but to remind him that some lessons should only be learned once." I turned to him, my tone soft but steady. "Thank you for standing on the side of what's right." He shook his head. "No, thank you for believing that justice was still worth fighting for." On the drive home, I rolled down the window. The ocean breeze rushed in, salty, cold, but peaceful. And I realized something. Strength doesn't always come from winning. Sometimes it's just the courage to face your pain and not let it turn you into someone else. If you've ever fought to reclaim what's right, no matter how small, leave a mal in the comments below. Let's remind the world together. Justice isn't just a courtroom story. It's the voice of every heart that refuses to be trampled. I drove toward the quiet suburb where Robert lived, the narrow road shaded by old oak trees. The late sun slanted through the windshield, scattering broken light across my hands on the wheel. At every red light, his face flashed in my mind. Familiar, yet distant. I once held that little boy's hand as he learned to walk, shielded him from the rain with a torn coat when we had nothing but a leaking roof. And now that same boy had become the man who forced his mother into court just to keep her dignity. When I reached his house, it was eerily silent. The grass outside was overgrown, the windows shut tight, and his old Toyota sat crooked in the driveway. I knocked. No answer. I was about to turn away when the door creaked open and Robert appeared. His eyes were sunken, his beard unshaven, his face gaunt, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "Mom," he said softly, voice hoarse and trembling. "Weren't you going to open the door for me?" I asked, stepping inside before he could respond. The house was a mess, papers and bills scattered across the table, an empty wine bottle rolling on the floor. "You look just like this place, broken and exhausted." Robert sank into a chair, head lowered. "I know why you came. You won, Mom. You have the house, the law's on your side. What more do you want?" I looked straight at him. "I didn't come to talk about winning or losing. I came to ask you one thing. Why?" He stayed silent for a long time before speaking, his voice heavy. "I don't know. It started small. When Megan lost her job and the debts piled up, I thought, maybe I could just borrow your house for a while, then fix it later. But she said if you refused, it meant you didn't see us as family. She said you never trusted anyone but yourself." I sat across from him, calmer than I expected. "And you believed her?" He nodded, eyes distant. "I thought you'd fight me like always." "You're always right, always in control. I got tired, Mom. I just wanted something that felt like mine." A sad laugh escaped me, and without realizing it, tears followed. "Something of your own, Robert? Everything I've worked for, your schooling, the house, every opportunity. Wasn't that enough?" "It's not like that," he muttered. "It's just, when I'm around you, I always feel small. I wanted to prove I could take care of my family without you running the show." I looked at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "If independence was what you wanted, I would have helped you. But you didn't choose honesty. You chose deceit. And once you walk that road, don't expect me to hold your hand again." Robert buried his face in his palms. "I know. And I regret it. But it's too late now, isn't it?" I didn't answer right away. I stood, walked to the shelf, and picked up an old photo. Him at 8 years old, sitting on my shoulders, laughing in the garden full of red geraniums. "It's never too late to do the right thing, son. But it has to be real, not just apologies, but accountability." "What can I even do?" he asked, his eyes hollow. "My job's gone. Neighbors avoid me. Megan took the kids and left. I've lost everything." "No," I said softly. "You still have your integrity. If you're willing to find it again, tell the truth in court. Admit your part. I can ask Thomas to help reduce the charges, but only if you're honest." He looked at me, silent. In his eyes, I saw the battle between fear and conscience. Then he turned to the window, staring out at the dim afternoon light. "I was wrong, Mom. I let someone else control my life. But do you know what hurt the most? Your silence. Sometimes your quiet made me feel like I'd never be enough." His words pierced deeper than I expected. Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been too strict, too proud, forgetting that the boy inside him never really grew up. "Maybe I'm guilty too," I admitted. "I thought giving you everything would make you grateful. But I forgot. Love isn't building a house for someone to live in. It's teaching them how to build one on their own." Robert turned, his eyes red. "It's too late, Mom. I've lost it all." I smiled faintly. "No, you still have a chance to rebuild. But this time, you'll have to do it yourself." The room fell quiet. Then Robert slowly knelt in front of me. "Mom, I'm sorry." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "I forgive you.
but I won't forget. Don't apologize just in words. Prove it. You were your father's pride once. Don't make him bow his head in shame where he rests. He nodded, tears spilling onto my hands.
Thank you, Mom. I stood, walking toward the door. Now get up, Robert. And when you're ready to make things right, come knock on that seaside house. I won't lock it, but I'll only open it if you've truly earned it. As I drove away, the sun was sinking low. The road back to the sea was long and silent. Wind brushed through my silver hair, carrying the salt of the ocean and the taste of old memories. In the rearview mirror, I saw Robert standing in the doorway, small, lost, like a child watching his mother leave all over again. I stopped by the shore, listening to the steady rhythm of the waves. A gull landed nearby, tilting its head as if asking what came next. I whispered, "Some battles aren't about victory. They're about not losing your humanity." My phone buzzed, a message from Thomas. "The court has officially confirmed your ownership. Megan's case is moving to criminal prosecution. Would you like to attend the public hearing?" I stared at the screen for a while, then typed back, "Yes. I'll be there, not for revenge, but to witness the truth." I looked up at the sky, painted in soft purple and gold, and felt a strange peace. The anger had ebbed away, carried off by the tide. I understood now. Justice isn't about making others fall. It's about freeing yourself from the darkness they left behind. The ocean breeze was cold against my skin, but I smiled. My fight wasn't over, but I had already won. Not in the courtroom, but in my heart. 2 weeks later, the first hearing took place at the Charleston County Court. That morning, I arrived early, wearing a pale gray dress and the old knitted cardigan my late husband once gave me. Thomas walked beside me, a thick file in his hand, his calm voice steadying me. "Don't worry," he said. "Our evidence is solid. Today, the truth will finally speak." The courtroom was fuller than I expected. Local reporters, curious neighbors, and quiet onlookers filled the benches. I sat in the front row, my hands clasped. Then Megan entered from the opposite door, dressed in a dark, tailored dress, makeup flawless, but tension flickered in her eyes. Behind her came Robert, head lowered, hands gripping a folder so tightly his knuckles turned white. I recognized that trembling hand. It was the same hand that once held a hammer to help me build our seaside home, brick by brick. The sound of the gavel cut through the murmurs. The judge spoke firmly, and the session began. Thomas stood, his voice clear and controlled. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, is the rightful owner of the residence on Ocean View Drive, as verified by over 2 decades of property records and tax filings. We have evidence that her daughter-in-law, Mrs. Megan Dyson, conspired with a third party to falsify a medical report declaring Mrs. Crawford mentally unfit in an attempt to fraudulently transfer ownership. Today, we seek recognition of this fraud and the restoration of my client's honor." Megan's lawyer, a young, sharp-suited man with arrogance in his tone, rose quickly. "Your Honor, my client acted under the legal authorization of Mr. Robert Crawford, Mrs. Crawford's son. Every action was made in the family's best interest, without intent to defraud." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Do you have legitimate proof of the medical incompetence you claim?" The lawyer hesitated, then muttered, "We are awaiting a verification report." Thomas allowed himself a faint smile. "Then, Your Honor, may I present the statement from the real physician, the one whose name and signature were forged? This is a recorded message provided to investigators." The audio filled the courtroom, the calm, steady voice of a middle-aged man. "I have never examined any patient named Eleanor Crawford. The documents with my signature are complete forgeries." A hush swept through the room. Megan's head dropped. Her attorney tried to request a recess, but the judge waved him off. "Continue." Thomas went on. his tone precise. Additionally, we have video, photographic, and testimonial evidence proving that my client was unlawfully evicted from her own home. Furthermore, here is proof that Mrs. Dyson sold several of my client's personal belongings. A screen lit up, showing a screenshot from Megan's group chat. Finally living in the dream house of that stupid old woman. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Megan turned sharply to Robert, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. Then came my turn. Thomas called me to the stand. I rose, walked slowly to the witness podium, and spoke steadily into the microphone. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to prove that age does not take away a person's right to be respected. I worked my whole life for that house, and I will not let anyone, not even my own blood, steal it through deceit. The judge nodded. Mrs. Crawford, do you wish to say anything to your son? I turned. Robert's eyes were red, brimming with shame. Yes, I said softly but firmly. Forgiveness doesn't erase wrongdoing, but it can save a soul. I don't want my son to be branded a thief. I just want him to remember that justice isn't a weapon. It's the boundary of one's conscience. Robert's shoulders trembled. Then, slowly, he stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, I'd like to testify. Megan's lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it. Robert took a breath. It's all my fault. I signed the papers. I let Megan convince me. She said it was just paperwork, that Mom would never know. But I did know. I knew I was betraying her. Megan leapt up, her voice shrill. Shut up! You're ruining everything! The gavel struck the bench. Order in the court, the judge commanded. Robert looked at me, tears streaming. No, Megan. We ruined everything, out of greed, pride, and cowardice. He swallowed hard. Mom, I'm sorry. I'll take responsibility. I didn't speak. I simply nodded. For a moment I saw the boy he once was, the same little boy who had cried when he broke my favorite vase and tried to glue it back together, piece by piece. The hearing lasted over 3 hours. When it was done, the judge's verdict rang through the room. The property at Ocean View Drive is legally and solely owned by Mrs. Eleanor Crawford. The actions of Mrs. Megan Dyson constitute willful fraud and property theft. The case will proceed to criminal prosecution. The room erupted in murmurs. Megan collapsed into her chair. Robert sat frozen, his hands covering his face. Thomas placed a steady hand on my shoulder. It's over, Mrs. Crawford. You've won. Through the truth, I looked toward my son. No longer angry, only deeply sad. When officers approached to escort Megan out, she glanced back at me, her eyes a mix of fear and bitterness. I met her gaze and said quietly, I hope you learn what my youth taught me. When you lose your integrity, you lose everything. Outside, the sun was bright and warm. Neighbors clapped softly as I stepped down the courthouse steps. You did the right thing, Mrs. Crawford, someone called out. Thomas smiled. Seems you've become a symbol for more than just yourself. I smiled faintly. If my story helps even one person stand up for justice, then it's all been worth it. We drove over the bridge toward the sea. I rolled the window down, the wind tangling through my silver hair. Below, the waves crashed against the rocks, fierce, unending, alive. And I knew that from this day on, everything would be different. Justice isn't just what a judge declares. It's the moment you can look into the eyes of the one who hurt you and no longer tremble. As we neared Ocean View Drive, Thomas asked quietly, What will you do now? I smiled. Go home. Wipe away the dust, replant the geraniums, and open the windows to the sun. I fought long enough. And inside me, a voice whispered, calm and clear, Eleanor Crawford has come home. Not just to her house, but to her pride, her peace, and herself. I returned to my seaside home on a quiet, early summer morning. The air carried the sharp scent of salt, and the waves crashed against the shore like an old friend's greeting. The iron gate still creaked when it opened, the same familiar ket, but this time, that sound didn't sting. It felt light, almost tender. Thomas had been right. I hadn't won through vengeance, but through truth. And now, it was time to live in peace. Inside, the house was silent, except for the steady ticking of the wall clock. I walked from room to room, touching the old scratches on the walls, the faded curtains, every object that had patiently waited for me to come back. I placed my hand on the kitchen counter, the same place where Megan once stood, smirking as she called me a clingy old woman. Now that very spot stood as proof of the opposite. I hadn't clung to anyone. I had only held on to what was rightfully mine. That afternoon, I called in a small team of young workers to help restore the house. Kind, respectful people who worked with laughter in their voices. One of them asked, "Ma'am, how could such a beautiful home stay empty for so long?" I smiled and said, "Because sometimes people have to walk through storms to realize where they truly belong." A young woman named Haley paused her painting and said, "You sound just like my mom. She always says if you don't stand up for yourself, no one else will." I chuckled softly. "Then your mother is a wise woman." When they left, I brewed a cup of tea and sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The light stretched golden across the sea, and for a moment, I saw my husband's smile, gentle and steady, standing by the row of red geraniums we once planted together. I whispered, "You see, love? I kept our home after all." The wind answered softly, as if it understood. A week later, Robert came. I recognized his old car from a distance. He stepped out slowly, holding a small bouquet of lavender, my favorite. I opened the gate without a word. Robert bowed his head and placed the flowers on the steps. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." I looked at him, thinner, older, but with something new in his eyes. Not pride, not shame. Something closer to humility. "Come in," I said simply. "The house isn't locked anymore." He walked in, glancing around the freshly painted walls. "You fixed the place up." "It feels warmer, calmer." "I just cleaned away the old stains," I replied. "But some things can't be washed off with water. Time has to soften them." We sat across from each other at the kitchen table. "I came to return the restitution money," he said softly, sliding a check across the table. "And to apologize. For the last time I looked at the check but didn't touch it. Money doesn't matter. What matters is the lesson, and it seems you've learned it." Robert nodded, eyes glistening. "After the trial, I lost my job, my friends. Megan's under investigation. But what keeps me awake isn't any of that. It's the memory of you standing there in court, calm, strong, without a trace of hate. I've never seen courage like that." I smiled faintly. "Courage isn't born with us, son. It comes when we've already lost everything else. I lost your father. I lost my trust. So the only thing left to protect was myself." Robert's tears spilled as he reached across the table. "Can you ever forgive me?" I took his hand, my fingers trembling but warm. "I forgave you long ago, but now you have to forgive yourself. Carrying guilt forever doesn't make you better. It just keeps you from moving forward." He nodded, voice breaking. "I'll try. I'll start over. Maybe move somewhere new. Find work. Raise the kids right. I just hope you'll still let them visit you." I smiled gently. "Of course." This house will always have room for anyone who finds their way back with an honest heart. That evening, after he left, I stood on the porch watching his car disappear behind the hills. There was no anger left, only quiet peace, like the tide gently touching the shore. I knew then, sometimes people have to crash into their own mistakes before they can truly grow. Months later, I received a letter from Thomas. Inside was a clipping from the local paper titled, "70-year-old woman wins justice in family fraud case." The article told my story, not as a tragedy, but as an example of resilience and grace. Beneath it were hundreds of comments. This story reminded me of my mother. She proves that age is never weakness. I cried when she said, "Forgiveness doesn't erase the sin, but it can save a soul." I folded the paper and smiled, not with pride, but with gratitude. My journey had reached people I would never meet. Maybe my scars had become a quiet reminder that kindness is not weakness. That night, I lit a single candle in the living room. Outside, the waves murmured like a heartbeat. I opened my old journal and wrote, "I didn't fight to defeat anyone. I thought not to forget who I am. I may be old, but I still have a heart that loves, and hands steady enough to hold on to what's right." I closed the book, placed it on the table, and opened the window wide. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, glowing against the mirror. There, I saw the reflection of a silver-haired woman with calm eyes and a quiet smile. The house was finally still, but inside, a voice whispered clearly, Eleanor Crawford didn't just reclaim her home. She reclaimed her heart, and that, I knew, was the truest victory of all. And so, the story of Mrs. Eleanor Crawford came to an end, not with tears, nor with bitterness, but with the gentle light of peace and forgiveness. From a mother betrayed by her own daughter-in-law, cast out of the very home she built with her own hands, she chose to stand up, not for revenge, but to reclaim her dignity and her right to justice. Through long court hearings, cold nights, and cruel whispers, Eleanor never lost her calm. She understood that a woman's true strength doesn't come from making others fear her, but from helping them see their wrongs through compassion. The house on Ocean View Drive, once a symbol of betrayal, has now become a place of rebirth and grace. Eleanor didn't just reclaim her property. She reclaimed her faith in people, in herself, and in the goodness still left in this world. Her story reminds us all that no matter your age, no matter how deep the hurt, you always have the right to stand tall, to speak your truth, and to live with dignity. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this video so that more women can find strength in the story of Eleanor Crawford, the woman who proved that justice doesn't only live in the courtroom, but in the heart that dares to do what's right. Thank you for staying with us until the end. See you in the next story, where the lessons of family, compassion, and courage will once again be told through tears and through smiles.